Salutations, fellow nerds. I'm Rick Y, the wise guy, and today is February 11th, 2025. The Trump administration has been hit with a few legal challenges to his authority, and it is here that we see the true power and grit of the United States, and whether we actually live in a nation that prides itself on the rule of law and not the whims of a singular man and his declarations. So if you enjoy news, history, or humorous American hogwash, make sure to drop a blue heart in that comment section for me and help bring a voice to the new resistance. One of the most important foundational understandings here in the United States is that we have three separate but co-equal branches of government. They're the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive powers. These powers are given to different bodies of our government intentionally so as to keep any one power from overriding the other. The president is the executive. Congress is the legislative body, and the courts from the federal, spread across different states, up into the Supreme Court, are actually part of the judiciary. Yet we are in a moment in time where the executive branch has been haphazardly casting declarations without concern for their constitutionality, and has been subsequently challenged by federal judges, as is their job. This happens all the time. It happened under Obama, as it also happened under every other president, who would have loved to just go around simply changing everything with the stroke of a pen. Could you imagine what he could or would have done after Sandy Hook if the executive branch had that much authority? We would have had a First Amendment and then immediately a Third Amendment. That's what would have happened. Lone dudes just swiping away decades, nay, 2 centuries of jurisprudence maintaining their responsibilities. And that's exactly what we face right now. Let's start with a recent post by the new Vice President, J.D. Vance. He states, if a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the Attorney General to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control executives' legitimate power. Oddly enough, this is a sentiment that is starting to spread like wildfire, and it's kind of rather concerning to anyone who didn't sleep through their government and civics classes. There's this idea that somehow federal judges can't or shouldn't be able to challenge any kind of unconstitutional decree by the executive branch, which is complete, pure D foolishness. But let's cover what J.D. Vance had to say, because it in itself is nonsensical. I can point out by immediately asking what happens if a general decides to carry out an unconstitutional order to round up American citizens and start detaining them without due process. What if that general committed war crimes? What if that general violates other U.S. or international laws? Are we really going to sit here and allow the vice president and a veteran of our armed services to claim that there's no legal recourse for a general as long as he was giving orders to his troops? This is why logical fallacies sound good up and until you start poking at them a little bit. Also, the judiciary does not command anyone, to include Pam Bondi, our Attorney General. J.D. Vance, while the second in command, doesn't seem to understand the conflated differences between military command and prosecutorial discretion, which has been used plenty of times against Democratic executives in the past. Anyone who's seen the movie A Few Good Men from 1992 will understand that you can indeed pursue legal recourse for actions directed by military orders. But then Scott Jennings, the most sycophantic talking head on cable news television right now, went on to Abby Phillips' show. This man's entire repeated position and claim was that, quote, a judge should decide how and when a money is spent for years and not the president? And again, unsurprising, this is a logical fallacy. First, nobody is saying that, and that isn't the position. This classic strategy is called a straw man. And to highlight the truth of the matter, the sole responsibility for spending and controlling money belongs to Congress. They've already allocated and spent the money, and Trump is now trying to say that, oh, no, we need to halt all of these expenditures that have already been voted upon and simply not pay our bills. To those of you who have kept up with this man and his way of cheating businesses out of contractually earned money, none of this should be new. If there is one thing that has defined Trump's rise in the business world, it was taking everything while paying out nothing. Refusing to pay the due bill is Trump's MO. It always has been. The problem here is that he doesn't have the legal authority to step in and make these decisions. If you're curious about where you can find these rules, Handy dandy notebook. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 of the United States Constitution, known as the Appropriation Clause, and it states, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. This means that the executive branch cannot spend money unless Congress has specifically authorized it already through appropriations. In 1974, this premise was further reinforced through the Impoundment Control Act, which limits presidents' ability to refuse to spend funds that Congress has already appropriated. The law requires the president to seek congressional approval before delaying or rescinding spending. This isn't new. During Nixon's administration, he also attempted to impound billions of dollars that Congress had already allocated for domestic programs, including the EPA, education, and construction of new highways. Congress saw this as an abuse of executive power, essentially overriding the legislative branch's control over federal spending. A better and more recent example of this is when Biden halted construction of Trump's border wall, which had admittedly been started with funding that had been allocated by Congress. Reluctantly, but in accordance with constitutional law and executive responsibility, he was forced to restart the construction in 2023. And whether I agree with the border wall or not is irrelevant. It wasn't Biden's role to do that. He was justly challenged in federal courts and overruled. This is democracy in action in a country that prides itself on the rule of law above all else. But before those who pride themselves in being knowledgeable of the Constitution need to slow your roll, because there is a big, some could say supreme, kink in this chain. Trump is currently ignoring the court order, as directed by a federal judge. U.S. District Judge John McConnell Jr. ordered that federal funds be immediately unfrozen, which Trump has also showed interest in appealing, which will put this case in front of the Supreme Court. George Conway put it bluntly that the executive branch could tell the U.S. Marshals not to uphold any orders by the court, and they'll have to follow Trump's orders based upon legal chain of command. He then went on to say that when that happens, quote, our 236-year experiment in the federal rule of law and a democratic self-governance for the United States of America in American constitutionalism is essentially over. And he's right. The only way this comes out even remotely fair and balanced is if the Supreme Court rules against Trump's decisions to freeze allocated funds but refuses to hold him legally responsible for having failed to uphold his oath to the Constitution and ignoring federal court orders. These are the moments where integrity matters. The folks who claim to be constitutionalists above all else are now in the only position that they've ever tried to convince the world that they demonstrate unbiased decision-making. And yet here we are. Nothing but excuses and explanations as to why it's perfectly fine for Trump to be a dictator, but it wasn't for any other president before him. Folks, we are actually at the cusp of a true constitutional crisis. And we may be soon called upon to get our signs and walking shoes out, because this may have to be taken to the streets if we ever wish to see this country as a shining city on a hill, instead of crumbled ruins of a once majestic empire taken down by the tiny hands of history's stupidest emperor. Thanks for hanging in there with me. If you found that you liked the content, it would be great if you shared it so we can keep the message strong. If you considered liking and subscribing, that would also go a long way in this resistance. Y'all come back now. You hear?